Hi, this is Jeff. I failed to record the lesson we had this morning on Joel chapter 1, so I'm going to record this session. I just want to do that for those who weren't able to join us this morning, so you have a feel for this first chapter. Joel begins much like Obadiah did, the word of the Yahweh that came to Joel, son of Pethuel. And with Obadiah, we only had his name. At least with Joel, we have the name of his father too. But we don't have anything else to know about Joel. Pethuel isn't mentioned anywhere else in Scripture, and although there are a handful of Joels, none of them seem to line up with the Joel that wrote this book. So we don't know anything more about him than this little bit. So as we fill in our background slide on the book of Joel, that's all we can say. The author was Joel, son of Pethuel. Who is his audience? In verse 2, he mentions elders and inhabitants of the land. And we can tell from verse 14, where he talks about the temple, that these elders and inhabitants are near the temple and therefore in the land of Judah. So, like Obadiah, Joel is categorized as one of the prophets to the people of Judah, the southern kingdom. Although in the days of Joel, it's probably not the time of the kingdom, but the time after the exile. And that brings us to the dating. We can tell it's after the exile because in chapter 4, verse 2, there's a mention of the Israelites being scattered amongst the nations. This seems pretty clear to be a reference to the exile after the fall of Jerusalem. And in chapter 2, verse 9, there's a mention of the walls of Jerusalem. And so probably that places it after the time of Nehemiah. And so we have about 100-year window between 445 and 345 when Joel might have happened. There are estimates much earlier than that, and a few even later, but that 100-year window is when we know. It's not a very narrow window at all with 100 years one way or the other, but we just don't know when he was writing. Joel doesn't give us enough information to know that. But despite the fact that we don't know exactly what year he was writing, we do know the occasion. A locust swarm had wiped out food supplies. We can tell that from verse 4, which we'll look at in a few minutes. And possibly that was coupled with a drought. The very last couple of verses of this chapter seem to refer to conditions that are drought-like conditions. Whatever it is that it is just a locust or locust and drought, the circumstances are dire in the land of Judah, and food is scarce, and it is a national crisis. And the national crisis that came in the wake of that locust swarm, it just seems to resonate so clearly with the national crisis that we are in America now with the COVID-19 pandemic, that when I read through Joel chapter 1, everything just seems to connect with our day-to-day lives now. And so a lot of what I have in my notes here are just ways that we can hear what Joel is saying and then respond to it for our own current circumstances. He starts out in verses 2 and 3 saying, "Hear this, O elders, and give ear, all the inhabitants of the land. Has this happened in your days, or the days of your ancestors? Tell it to your children, and your children to their children, and their children to the following generation." Here, Joel is pointing out how unique this moment is in the history of Israel. This kind of devastation has not happened in living memory and hasn't been recorded in the ancient annals, and it's not likely to happen in the days of the children or their children, and so they need to pass this along. They need to tell the lessons learned from their experiences to their children so it is not forgotten. These lessons need to be passed on from one generation to the next. And that's like our circumstance here. We have learned a few lessons from COVID-19 already, and we are likely to learn more before it's all over. And we need to take this unique moment. The locust swarm was unprecedented in Joel's day, and how often do we hear unprecedented used to describe our circumstances now? But we need to learn and pass those lessons along. Whether it's appreciating that church isn't just something we do on Sunday, and it isn't just gathering together, that the definition of what it means to go to church is not sufficient, because we can't gather on Sundays now, but we still need to be the church. And that definition of being the church as just getting together on Sunday has never been fully accurate, but it's been our social norm for so long, it's just ingrained. But this experience has shaken us out of that complacency into thinking differently about what it means to be the church. And that we need to pass that lesson along to our children as much as we can. Same thing with our educational system. We've taken teachers for granted for so long, and the fact that we can send our kids to school on any given weekday during the school year, and we can't do that now. It changes our perspective on what it means to have the educational system. And any discussion of education reform and educational system going forward is going to be colored by the experiences we have now. And that's probably a good thing as we learn these lessons, but we need to pass them on too, so that they're not forgotten in the future. In verse 4, Joel says, "What the cutting locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust left, the hopping locust has eaten. What the hopping locust left, the destroying locust has eaten." Now, Joel actually uses 4 different words for locusts in the Hebrew in this verse. I'm reminded of what they say about the Eskimos and their multiple words for snow, how they have different words for packed snow versus loose snow, and different kinds of snow. And the more important a concept is in your culture, the more words you have for it. Well, they had multiple words for these kinds of insects in Hebrew because they were an important part of their ecosystem. They were often a pest that would be a problem they had to deal with, but in this case, the problem was magnified to the point that it was devastating. So devastating, in fact, that in verse 6, Joel compares it to an invading army. He says, "Because a nation has invaded my land, strong, beyond counting. Its teeth are the teeth of a lion, and its fangs are those of a lioness." A locust is just a little bitty insect. You could step on one and kill it. Individually, they're no big threat. But in swarms of millions, they are a serious threat. So that even lions are not a bigger threat than the locusts. And an invading army. And it felt like they had just been wiped out by a foreign power. And right now in America, it can feel that way too. Donald Trump has described himself now as a wartime president, and he's considering using wartime powers to ask companies, in fact, force companies, to produce ventilators or masks or other resources to help fight the infection and help keep people alive who are infected. It feels like that, and we can have deprivations that are like a wartime when we have to stay in our homes, and we have to take all these precautions about going out in public. It can feel like a war. On the other hand, can see that as evidence that our country can come together. Since the time of World War II, our culture has gotten a little more accustomed to creature comforts, and there was some question as to whether the people in our country could face a serious threat with the kind of bravery and courage of the greatest generation. And I think this pandemic and our response to it shows that we do have people of great courage and bravery in our country now at all levels. the trained professionals who are in the hospitals, the nurses and doctors and others who are doing their job, exposing themselves to people who have this infection on purpose every day to serve them, is a great amount of bravery. And that translates all the way down to the high school dropout who didn't finish education but is facing the grocery store to be there to stock the shelves, to help the customers, to get things out there. And they are also exposing themselves to the people who could be infected, who shop and don't observe social distancing while they're out there in the Targets and Walmarts and stores around us, the grocery stores, the Krogers. People are out there, and the people who work in those places may not be trained professionals, but they are no less brave for getting out there and doing their jobs day in and day out, and facing that danger. So it may feel like an invasion, may feel like an enemy, but we have stood up to that enemy, and we are continuing to do so. Joel continues, he says, "Lament like a virgin girded in sackcloth for the husband of her youth." Just a side note before I get to the heart of this message, it kind of reminds me when he talks about a virgin, a woman who has a husband, of that cultural difference between their world and ours, where a betrothed relationship was like husband and wife, as in Mary and Joseph. Mary was betrothed to Joseph, a stronger relationship than just what we would call a fiancé. It was a commitment, but it was a legal commitment, like a marriage. And Mary and Joseph we think of in that context, but here we have kind of similar situation, but this young woman has lost her husband, probably to starvation, probably due to the deprivations of the locusts. I don't think this is just a metaphor for a comparison to something that doesn't have an actual experience behind it. People were suffering loss in the wake of the locusts, destruction of their resources, and Joel is giving permission to lament, to cry out in sadness and in mourning for the loss that the locusts have brought. And we have people in our world who have lost lives, tens of thousands who have lost loved ones because of the COVID-19 crisis as well. We can definitely relate to this lament. In verse 9, Joel says, "The offering and libation are withheld from the house of Yahweh. The priests mourn, the ministers of Yahweh." And so here the normal worship cycle at the temple between offering and libation, which were the burnt offering and the poured out wine offerings and frankincense offerings, these couldn't happen because the animals weren't available. They were either needed for food or just all had perished. And so they couldn't offer sacrifices, and they couldn't pour out wine because the locusts had destroyed the vines. So the offering and the libation are withheld not voluntarily, but because the resources just aren't there. And in our world, we're suffering from the inability to do our worship practices the way we normally do them too. We can't come together and worship as a congregation, and so we mourn this loss. Joel continues in chapter 1, verse 12, "The vine withers and the fig tree droops, the pomegranate tree and the palm tree, the apple tree, all the trees of the field are dried up. Indeed, joy is dried up among the sons of men." So it is an emotional crisis, not just a tangible one. It's not just the physical things that are affected. It's the heart. The soul is in pain because of the crisis. And indeed, we see that now. Joy has dried up. Jamie Matthews shared this morning that she's an extroverted person. She gets a lot of joy out of being around other people, and that just isn't happening right now because of this social distancing that we have to do. And we can't partake of the kind of collective things, the parties and celebrations, even the collective mourning that we might do at a funeral. We just can't. We can't come together. And some things, like the young woman who lost her husband in Joel's verse, have gone and can't be restored. They can't be brought back. Here's the high school trip that won't happen, or the graduation ceremony. There's the birthday party that nobody can come to because of the social distancing. So there are things that we can mourn, and it's legitimate and valid to lament. That word that Joel used of the young woman, lament, to cry out in sadness and sorrow and mourning. This is a legitimate, valid way to respond, even in faith, to our circumstances. Faith does not mean that you're not sad. Faith does not mean that you do not mourn a loss. Faith means that you can mourn your loss, and you can bring that loss to God, and you can bring your heart and bare your heart and soul to Him in good times and bad, and He will rejoice with you and will comfort you even in that mourning. But you can mourn and lament, and it's a valid way to respond. In verses 13 and 14, Joel advises the priests to do it. Gird yourself and lament, O priests. Wail, O ministers of the altar. Come spend the night in sackcloth, O ministers of my God, because offering and libation are withheld from the house of your God. Solemnize a fast, call an assembly, gather the elders, all of the inhabitants of the land, in the house of Yahweh your God, and cry out to Yahweh. This is the corporate response, the response together. As a Christian community, Fairmount Christian had a day of prayer, and members of the church from all over committed to a certain time to pray during that day. So we had a corporate day of prayer, even though we did it individually in our homes. And we can still worship together, which we're doing on Sundays through YouTube and through live streaming. We are still coming together to sing and to pray and to hear God's message. We are still worshiping together, and we can do that in community, even if we have to stay in our homes to do it. And Joel ends his book, verses 19 and 20, with his personal response. To you, O Yahweh, I cry out, because fire has devoured the pastures of the desert, flames burned all the trees of the field, and the beasts of the field long for you, because the courses of water are dried up, and fire has devoured the pastures of the desert. So this is his personal response, and he is meditating on some of the other natural disastrous effects, how the trees and the beasts of the field, and indeed the wild beasts, have been suffering along with the human population because of the deprivations caused by the locusts. So he feels this deeply, and he personally cries out. So we can have individual responses. As Christians, we can do things individually. We, of course, can pray, and we can lament individually towards God and express ourselves and still have that relationship with God. As I've heard said in the last couple of weeks, God isn't observing social distancing. He's still close to us. He's still with us in spirit, and He comes near. So we can still pray and still hear from Him through His Word, and we can still experience a nearness from God. But we can also individually be Christians to our neighbors. We can be wise about hand sanitizer and masks if necessary, and protecting ourselves from the viral infection, while still reaching out to our neighbors and our family and providing a strength in our society and through our neighbors and through our individual acts. So we can do things individually to still be faithful to Christ and be a light to our neighbors and to our world around us, even in the midst of this crisis. Well, I hope you've gotten some blessing out of this walk through Joel chapter 1. We're going to look at Joel chapter 2 next week together. If you're part of the Salt and Light class, I encourage you to go to our group on faithlife.com and continue the discussion of Joel there. And I will post some of these questions out to a discussion group in our Faith Life group so that we can continue our talk there, especially since I didn't get our discussion recorded this morning. I pray this is good for you and a blessing, and just be well. And we'll see you next week.